topic is right up here, and the background, as we know, is the geopolitical headwinds that are really starting to impact us. We thought we could escape all this, but it doesn't look like we can escape it anymore. And it's right around the corner, maybe. And I'd like to start with you, Ambassador Heng. You were Singapore ambassador in the US for 16 years.
Right.
And more importantly, you wear a very important Asia Society hat, which is, could you give us a sense from a Singaporean ringside perspective, what went wrong between the United States and China? And how do we in Southeast Asia see this? And is the situation irreparable?
Let me say that the US-China relationship has never been in such a bad place, and there seems to be no bottom to where it can fall. But I'm looking forward to the G20 meeting in Bali. I hope President Xi Jinping meets with President Biden and have some talks over two major issues,
sure,
and others. But even if they meet, do not expect that the relationship will go back to, pre-President Trump.
Mm-hmm.
Now, let me say that the United States and China, we've been used in the region and in the world with seeing, after 1972, a relationship of engagement between the two great powers because of détente. Now, the Chinese at that time, Mao Zedong, they were dealing with the ideological dispute of Russia, and they thought China would help. President Nixon wanted to end the war in Vietnam, and he understood that without China's help, it would be very difficult. So there was a strategic congruence between the two, and so they arrived at détente. The rest is history. Engagement between the United States and China then began. Sure, there were problems, human rights. China is a different system, different values, and so on. But the engagement continued. 1989, the Tiananmen was a reality check. Of course, in 1978, as we all know, China went on 4 modernizations, entering into the market economy, into the world, and engaging with the world. But 1989 suddenly reminded the United States that China is a different kind of system. It is a communist system, and you have differences on human rights. Now, that, however, did not prevent the United States and China from continuing to work. Mm. Although from 1989, I think Professor Luttwak will agree, the United States needed China less because the Cold War was coming towards an end. During the Cold War, you have the Soviet Union, so, you deal with China. But from then on, the Soviet Union was clearly, from 1989, weakening. In 1992, it imploded, or 1993. So I think that was what happened. Now, the relationships continued. There were human rights differences, but engagement was there, whether it was Reagan, Bush 41, Bush 43, Clinton, Obama, and so on. But I think the global financial crisis, which Professor Luttwak referred to, created a major change. The United States economy went into a tailspin, Wall Street collapsed, and you had China doing quite well, Japan doing quite well, Japanese, Chinese, and even Singapore went to the United States to buy bits of banks from Wall Street. The equation tilted. And I think from then, China felt assertive, felt stronger, and it was on the rise. It was on the rise, but this confirmed it. So what happened was that somewhere, I think, from the global financial crisis, China grew more assertive in Southeast Asia. We know it over the South China Sea. The United States was distracted. But what happened was that the United States, I think I would date it about maybe 2015, 2016, 17, they came to the realization that China had amassed critical power in the economy, in military, in technology, and soft power, as well as diplomatic clout and power. I think given that, suddenly the United States looked at China as a peer rival, a peer power. And, you know, then you saw the two powers locked in a fight for dominance in the world, predominance. Because the predominant power has the ability to define the rules of the road in the international system and in the international economic system, as well as set the example for other economies. So I think it's a question now, a fight for dominance, and this is what has gone wrong. What do we feel as Southeast Asians looking at this? I think with the rise of China, Southeast Asians, other countries, looked at China as an opportunity. It was also a challenge. And the question is, then how do you deal with China? The United States was always there since World War II. By the millennium, it was some 70 over years. Now it's nearly 80 years. The United States is a familiar presence. China is a rising power. And certainly Southeast Asian countries, we want to engage with both. We are greedy. You know, we want to dip into the Chinese market. We want to dip into the American market. We want aid from the United States. We want aid from China. Why not? We want to have both. But it's getting increasingly difficult given the competition. And I think though the powers, both the United States and China says, you don't have to choose, but they're forcing us to choose. And certainly with the United States taking the position it has now on pushing the technology competition, CHIPS Act and so on, I think in the region we are very concerned with the decoupling of the economies and what this technology decoupling means because of the supply chains and because so many of our economies are linked to this great production platform that joins Southeast Asia, China, and the United States. What was the third question?
The third question is the situation beyond repair? I mean, is this a fight to the finish?
You know, I'm a diplomat. The business of diplomats is to repair bad relationships. Otherwise, we have no work, you know. So, of course, I say we can try to repair. But what it means is that you are really trying to freeze a sinking relationship, a deteriorating relationship. Try to hold it at a certain level. Hope something will happen. Prevent it from falling, but it will fall. Then you lift it up again. But I think this rivalry, the tensions, will be there for a couple decades to come.
Before one side wins?
Before one side wins. But I'm not even sure in today's warfare that there are clear winners, because they will conduct warfare in different domains at different levels. Economic, you know, technology,
right.
Geopolitical.
Right. Prof. Wang, I remember you telling me once that about the Chinese emperor who ordered his ships, his navy to be burned because he only saw friends to the south. With your historical perspective, could you give us a sense of China's actions recently, you know, the military expansion, and its treatment of its southern neighbors today compared with, you know, the historical behavior of China?
That's a good question. It's related to the question of is war unavoidable? Because as a historian, I would say war is never avoidable because there are enough poor governments and stupid rulers and miscalculations will always be there. So that's my answer to that one. But where China is concerned, I have to say that for those thousands of years when China was the major power in this region, and in fact, if you put it in world history terms too, it has really been only a continental power. And I think it goes back to, if you use the term geopolitics, the geography does matter. And the Chinese geography has led them to think of the continent as being the threat to their existence, and the enemies have always come from the continent. So when you have been a continental power for over 2,000 years and have sustained that power successfully, more or less, for those 2,000 years, it takes a while to shift your gears, as it were, to something else. Now, what you mentioned about the fleets, yes, the Chinese had the capacity to build a navy long before anybody else had. And they had the largest navy imaginable at the time it did in the 14th century, 15th century. And they had been building that, of course, for several centuries. But when they sent it out to the Indian Ocean and went around wherever they could and found no enemies, they decided that that's not where we should put our money in. Our enemies are still across on the continent, and as you know, they saved all that money and used it to build a great wall. I mean, that's, in terms of strategy and in terms of expense, I think that was a very great waste of money, but still, that's what they did. And that wall didn't really save them. They continued to be invaded across that wall for the next few centuries. So they never had reason to change their view that the enemies come from overland to continent. So what really changed was something that happened only since the 18th century. For the first time, when we talk about globalization today, we are thinking in terms of economics. But actually, I would say globalization as a reality came from naval power. For the first time, one navy, or two navies if you like, could control the whole world by dominating the seas and access to everybody's coastline. And nobody could challenge them. And that was only since the late 18th century, I would say. And following that, you had a series of empires building on that naval power. Essentially the British, because they beat the French, but the two of them were rivals, and they remained rivals for the next 150 years, thereabouts. But of course, as national empires, with war being inevitable, they themselves fought themselves to a standstill, and their challenges from within Europe, into Western Europe, led to a complete destruction of that structure of national empires. But what was there, nevertheless, was a naval globalization, maritime global, I call it. That the Chinese had never encountered. They had never had an enemy. They'd never been invaded by sea, from the sea. They've never lost a sea battle because they never had to fight one. But to their surprise, just a few hundred ships with several, maybe tens of thousands of troops could actually defeat their navy along the whole of the coast. And not once, twice, but several times more, until even the Japanese got the point and built a similar navy and defeated the Chinese again. So from about 1800 thereabouts, the Chinese discovered the lack of a navy had made themselves vulnerable. And that's a lesson that they have not now forgotten. They've had 150 years of it. But what we have forgotten, I think, is that the continent is where the Chinese are still very concerned for their security. And if you look at it today, I think after the two world wars and so on, and the fall of the Soviet Union, the America as emerging as a sole superpower, that sole superpower could not control that continent. In fact, when the Chinese look at the continent today, I think the Chinese have never felt more secure about the continent than the whole of its history. I mean, Russia, the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia today is no threat to China. None of the stans, as it were, all the Islamic states, none of them are threats to China. If anything, they can protect China. They can help China feel more secure on the continent. What they haven't been able to deal with is the maritime threat. And that is something that they never really know how to deal with. Because if you look at the whole of the 20th century, China did not have a navy to speak of. In fact, I would say until 1990s, they had not seriously thought about naval power. Only when they had the money, the wealth of having joined, as it were, the free market economy, they earned enough money to start thinking about a navy, serious navy. Mm. So I think we have to take into account they never had one for 500 years, no navy to speak of. Only time they tried, they lost, and all the other battles at sea they lost. And they finally got around to building a navy in the 1990s, and they had enough money to build a lot of ships. But I think I agree completely with Mr. Luttwak that having a navy and having a lot of ships doesn't mean you win wars. You have to know how to fight at sea. And the Chinese have never fought at sea. Even Zheng He never had to fight. He was so dominant, they would just sail around and came back and said, no enemies out there. But the Chinese have never fought and won a war at sea. That's a base you have to bear in mind. So the sense of insecurity on the maritime coast remains with them for the last 150 years at least. Now from the American side, as a sole superpower, I think they did try to impose some kind of control over the continent, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, with the interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan, with their attempts while they were in Afghanistan to reach out to the stans, to Uzbekistan and so on. But really, it was a complete failure. What it proves is that the Americans are essentially not a continental power. They're a continental power on the American continent, but they're not a continental power. They do not really have the means or the capacity to control the continent, but they control the seas. The maritime power remains because they have inherited the British Empire's naval forces. The maritime globalization of the 18th century, while the British fell weak and the French and British have gone down the loop, as well, the Americans have taken over and made it even better, stronger, and their maritime power is supreme. There's no question about it. And I think the Chinese are totally aware of that. There's no question of challenging American naval power. Incidentally, I do agree also with Mr. Luttwak, all this business about cyberspace and all that, that's not really that important. It's a significant geopolitical rivalry is about the sea today. And that is why if you look around, the question of war between, conflict between the United States and China is not about the continent at all. In fact, the Americans have actually given up on the continent. Having given up the continent, that means they're not a global superpower. They're only a global superpower at sea. And this maritime global power is what they've got left. And if the Chinese challenge them at sea, that is unacceptable, no question. Fortunately, the Americans know perfectly well the Chinese are no threat to them at sea. All they can hope to do, the Chinese can hope to do, is to defend their own coastline. And that is why I think when you look around Asia, the maritime areas, there is no reason why there should be a war between America and China. Only one possible one, and that is Taiwan. I mean, the South China Sea is not a reason why they will fight. There's no way they will fight over the South China Sea or the East China Sea or any of the other places. China will not start a war because they know they're weak. The Americans don't need to start a war because they're strong. So the only reason for a potential war is Taiwan. And that has nothing to do, in a way, with the geopolitical scene in the past. This is about naval maritime supremacy. Because the American heritage of naval maritime power depends on total control of the sea. And Taiwan stands out as a kind of neither belonging one way to the other. China claims it to be part of a continental scene, and to the Americans, Taiwan is a crucial link in the maritime control over this part of the whole of Asia.
Right.
And for that reason, I think they cannot let Taiwan go. And this is, I think, the reason why we have reason to fear. That is something that could happen.
Sure.
And that could be miscalculation.
Right.
But I have no doubt the Chinese are not going to fight over Taiwan because they're weaker. And the Americans don't need to fight Taiwan, but what they can do is to continue to make Taiwan more and more attached and dependent on the United States so that the Chinese can never take Taiwan. If that is the goal, then we are in for very tense years, decades ahead.
Yeah, we'll just come to that in a second. Dr. Henry Wang, you are the sole Chinese voice here. We heard a lot of American opinion. You can take a couple of minutes more than your fellow panelists to lay out the Chinese perception of things. Could you, also touch on why you believe that you're having so many ruffles, with your neighbors? There are very, I have the former foreign minister of Indonesia sitting in our audience, His Excellency Pak Mati, and he'll tell you that, Indonesia always thought that they were not a party to the South China Sea conflict, but suddenly, because of the Natunas, they are dragged into a situation they may not want to be. Could you tell us what is troubling China that it behaves in a particular way?
Okay, great. Thank you, editor, and thank you also the Straits Times for inviting me to this great forum. I really enjoyed the previous speakers' comments. I think we're having a great transition time. Unprecedented. We've seen never seen in the history of mankind, because the great transformation of the world, basically. That we are almost reached 8 billion population now, and also Asia is rising, particularly exemplified ASEAN. That's really a great story of success, and so I can see now, and also of course, same is true with China. China is rising also fast. They just concluded the CPC 20th Party Congress. Basically summarized that in the last decade, China GDP growth has kept above 6%, and China become the largest trading nation with everyone, almost 130 countries in the world. So what I see actually, this morning I see Graham Allison, which is an old friend at Harvard Kennedy School, and I had quite a few dialogue with him too, and so I share some of his sentiment, but of course I think that the war is avoidable, basically.
War is?
Can be avoided.
Avoided.
Okay. That's why he was destined for war, but I would not say this is a destination that the human being has to get into. What I actually remember also, I talked to Joseph Nye. I had many dialogue with all those global opinion leaders, and basically he was telling me that by 2035, probably China, or 2040, China, US can reach some equilibrium, because I think this kind of rising of China, the process of really rising up, it takes the whole world by surprise, and then China has such a big, largest population, 5,000 years of history, big geographic landscape, and rapidly rising in the world, have a different system of governance. That's probably surprised many people, and then it takes time to get used to it. So what I would actually to see is, I think that the title of this conference is absolutely timely, is Asia Future. I think Asia now can be really a more prominent geopolitical force and balance in power, probably. Particularly ASEAN, I see as a very good example of how different countries works together for last 55, 56 years, very successfully. Now, ASEAN has 600 million population, almost half of China's population. So become the largest trading nation of China. So I think China can work with Asia to support the Asian big prosperity, like we have done together on the RCEP. China is willing to join CPTPP. My think tank, Center for China Globalization, is a strong support of China joining it.
Sure.
And also DPAR. Singapore is a party to DPAR, to CPTPP, and I noticed the Singapore Prime Minister just said Australia welcome China to join CPTPP. I think this is great. China can be also on those regional trade scheme, because I think the safest, the best measure to prevent the future war is by expanding the trade, expanding the prosperity, and expand the intertwine. among all nations, including the United States. I say that's why the U.S. Has 70,000 U.S. companies in China, generate 700 billion revenue a year. How can they really, the two countries decouple? In theory it can. But I think in the end it's really violating the market forces and competitive advantage, those, great, the economic law we've been following for so many years. So what I think is, the same is true, and we are now having the German chancellor visiting China soon. German company has 5,000 of them in China, and BASF just invested 10 billion in Guangdong, and BMW, Volkswagen, all expansion. So I think China, the party Congress reports that China has created 400 million middle class. Now they are seeking modernization, right? They are seeking the common prosperity. How about we lift another 300 million migrant workers in the urban center into the middle class? So I think there's a lot of market potential for China, and that which attract the world. I think that the attitudes the Chinese government taking is fine right now. For example, U.S. has put almost 1,000 Chinese companies on some kind of entity list or watchable list. But China has done very few, except this one or two companies selling weapons to Taiwan. China has not sanctioned any U.S. companies. So that's really, I personally think it's the right attitude. We want to engage. We want to relink, of course, and not decouple. We want to, strengthen the tie. So what I see the future for Asia, you mentioned about countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, and all those countries are doing great. I would think the ASEAN and China and even in the future with India, with Pakistan, and now also the Shanghai Cooperation Organization also expanding into economic domain now. Let's really practice the economic globalization further, inclusive, balanced, but not really military alliance, like we're strengthening NATO, we're strengthening Five Eyes, we're strengthening AUKUS, we're strengthening Quad, we're having IPEF, where China is doing basically, BRI, RCEP, trying to join CPTPP and DIPA, China-African Cooperation, and also FTA, China, Japan, and Korea. So China is pursuing economic globalization, still setting up more economic alliance rather than secure alliance. I think that's probably the right way to go. And so what I think now, it's doing great. For example, China's built a speed railway now in Indonesia. I think the president of Indonesia, we're going to take the G20 leaders to have a ride on that pretty soon. And we're building another speed railway in Thailand. We already built one to Laos. Let's connect all the ASEAN countries with the great economic connectivity of this part of the world. And let's show if we can really build prosperity and can really rise and support, become a big engine, support the future growth of the world. I think we're seeing a lot of problems in other parts of the world, but also China has its own challenges too. And it's all still affected by this COVID. We still have that pandemic still a big factor affecting China's GDP this year. So I think we have to really work together, and with all the countries. I agree totally with Professor Wang that South China will not be a problem. We can always peacefully utilize together joint exploitation and code of conduct.
I don't think Prof. Wang said South China is not a problem.
No.
I don't think he
what
said
I'm
that.
saying is not going to have a war. Yeah. He was saying the only war that could happen is in Taiwan. I agree with that. But South China Sea, we don't need to have a war. There's no possibility to have a war.
Oh, yeah.
We can work out, in the end,
sure.
From my personal perspective. So I think that, we talk about Asia is great. Asia is rising and Asia has a lot of opportunities. But I think, we should have Asian, American, Europe, and let's get all the continents work together. Strengthen multilateralism,
right.
And let's work together
right.
for the prosperity and peaceful. Let's fight the common threats, climate change, pandemic, all those, poverty and all those that facing the mankind. People from Mars will joke at us, people on the Earth. And all those global villagers, why they fight? Why can't they get along? It's really So can we overcome that? We're in a nuclear age now. It's going to be devastating if we have any conflict. So that is different than the 16th scenario that my friend Graham Allison was talking about. We're in a nuclear age. So anything is made area that could be devastating. So we have to be extremely careful to avoid that. So I think economic and prosperity is the only way to do that.
Right.
And China can play an active role for that.
Well, I get what you said, and I suspect, at least it's my personal belief, that some of the problems between the U.S. and China got worse after you mentioned 75,000 U.S. companies in China. Did you say that?
Yeah.
Well, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in Beijing, from 2014, they've been recording the profitability of American companies in China has been steadily coming down. That you might be aware of that. But I also want to take you up on this, what you just concluded with, talking about China as a force for prosperity for the region and all that. But we Asians, we believe in holistic ways of life and all that. Just the economy argument itself is not good enough for us. We also want to be treated well. We don't want to be trampled upon. So it's just an observation I want to make. But you heard Dr. Luttwak, you heard Allison. You said, Sir Henry, that it was avoidable. And I want to take a poll of the three of you. It might be avoidable, but is war inevitable? Is it a yes or a no?
I don't think the war is inevitable. I think that if we work hard, if we really work hard, and then we can really prevent that. I mean, that's why we see we have to. There's a Kinderberg trap now. I mean, there's a gap. I mean, U.S. is backing off all those multilateral system, creating during the Trump era, obviously. So China probably is not really strong enough to provide many global public goods, but China is trying. China is already the second largest donor to the United Nations now.
Sure.
And so let's really, this difficult adjustment period of time, let's really carefully maintain the global system. China doesn't want to change that.
Right.
Yeah.
Prof. Wang, what is your opinion, sir? What do you think? Is war inevitable in Asia?
If you take the possibility of all governments being rational and all leaders being wise, of course it's avoidable.
That's true, but Ambassador Heng just wrote a paper where she quoted Dr. Luttwak on great state autism, and given that it's not just states but even leaders can be autistic at times, and just looking at the facts as they are presented before you, do you think war is a possibility in Asia?
I think when I boil it all down, I think only the Taiwan issue makes it unavoidable, maybe unavoidable.
Unavoidable, thank you. And Ambassador?
I'd like to think it is avoidable, but the question is what can be done,
No. So, everything is avoidable,
no,
yes.
Because Graham Allison spoke about the need for strategic imagination. You cannot carry on as business as usual.
Yeah.
So that's one. The thing about Taiwan, I think, is that everybody is looking at it, and the United States doesn't want to go to war, they say.
Yep.
But some parts of Pentagon, as you would know, Professor Luttwak, thinks that if you're going to go to war with China, you should go now, when China is not ready yet, so you can defeat China or weaken them. So why not go now? So there's some sense.
Sure.
And maybe President Xi Jinping also, after his 20th Party Congress speech, he seemed to show that, reunification will happen. First, true peaceful reunification, if possible, negotiation, but force is on the table. Now, does he think that from now on, time is not on his side? So that changes the equation.
So it is possible.
It's possible, but I would say that the United States and China should be meeting more and more often. When I left the United States in 2012, there were some 300 plus dialogues between the United States and China.
Sure.
Ambassador Zhou Wenjun told me at every level, individuals, leaders, provinces, cities, associations. Today, dialogues are not going on. They're not meeting. So once you restore dialogues, can you move towards the path of avoiding war? In the year 2001, there was the EP3 incident.
Yes, of course.
Which happened.
Over Hainan, yeah.
Over Hainan, US plane and the Chinese plane. US plane
Sure.
did surveillance, got a bit too close to the coast. Chinese jet chased it out, crashed. At that moment, people thought there was going to be war. But war was avoided. And I've asked myself many times, if there should be a conflict by accident that takes place over Taiwan or South China Sea, you know, what is the mechanism that's in place now for the United States and China to stop that incident from flaring up to be war?
Prof. Wang, I'm quoting a Straits Times article that you wrote under your name, and you said that since 1949, China has always tried to find a safe position. Also that it is not in Southeast Asia's interest to prevent China being a superpower, that it does not intend to become a superpower based on naval might. So do you still hold that view now that President Xi has been in power for a decade?
I think China is a superpower among several possible superpowers. In other words, there's no question of being a sole global superpower that the United States looked like after the fall of the Soviet Union. That, I don't think, is something that the Chinese aspire to or could ever be. But one of the superpowers, because I think the multi-polar world is probably unavoidable. That, it seems to me, is likely. And if that happens, then there are several superpowers, then they can be balanced off in one way or the other. And Southeast Asia's position gives it some room to maneuver, especially when it is positioned between both a deep connection with the continent as well as a very deep connection with the maritime powers. So having both continental and maritime components in ASEAN, I think could possibly give us an extra level of wisdom about how to deal with the situation in the future.
Right. Henry, you know, I used to go to the Philippines in the 80s, and I used to find their nationalism used to be defined in anti-American terms. Today, when I go to Manila, I find the same nationalism being defined in anti-Chinese terms. What have you done to get into this situation? I mean, what are the, I mean, every country has its own fears and like individuals and all that. What are the, you know, factors that are making China behave in a certain way? You know, you entered the WTO and you learned to use the rules-based mechanism so effectively. You are wonderful in WTO and dispute resolution. You've mastered that game. But yet, when it comes to UNCLOS and South China Sea, you take a different position. Why is that so, Henry?
Well, I think the question actually you raised, I think, has some you know, pointed views there. Basically, what I think is that China basically has always practiced its you know, follow the WTO rule, follow the rule of the world and multilateral system. You know, China is a strong defender of the UN system and also support that. I think for South China Sea, I mean, we're having a lot of meetings, China, ASEAN, and let's get the code of conduct, let's get all those agreements in place. And I think, you know, South China Sea is really can be worked together with them, solve this issue by the neighboring countries in the region, right? Rather than we have some foreign powers to really, I don't see now, I mean, there's really, US now is really confronting China in South China Sea, but US used to say, okay, we don't take sides, you know, this is a matter between the country and the region. I think that probably still needs to be, you know, practiced. Let country in the region to talk about it and, you know, sit down and find a way to jointly explore, you know, benefit from that. So I don't see that as a problem in the end, because I think eventually with the boom of ASEAN, with the boom of China, I mean, with the economic integration of the countries, I mean, the views of the country could be changed. I would think, you know, that the last 3 years, this COVID situation does prevent the people-to-people exchanges. That is not helping the situation. China used to have 150 million people travel outbound, right? Most of them travel to 1 million, 10 million to Thailand, quite a few million to Singapore, right? And Malaysia and Indonesia. So I think that could happen again. Once we revive the COVID situation, and I think, you know, the economic integration, which I'm still a strong believer, that will really decide on the outcome and our views of all those people in the region. So
No,
China can be a beneficial.
But what prevents you from signing a legally binding code of conduct with ASEAN in the South China Sea?
Well, I'm not an expert on South China Sea,
Yes.
you know, but I think, you know, China, you know, the foreign ministry has said again and again they would like to work with countries in the region to solve the issue. I mean, that has been mentioned many times. So I don't think there's any big obstacles. I think why can't we, you know, have a serious discussion on those things? I mean, that would be really
This has gone on for a long time. Ambassador, would you have a point of view on this?
The South China Sea
Yes.
and China. Well, you know.
And also the fact that, you know, in the WTO, China has become a master of the game of the rules. But in this, you know, in the South China Sea, they don't want to even think about UNCLOS or recognize UNCLOS.
You know, on the South China Sea UNCLOS, China put in some reservations when they signed on to UNCLOS, and that left out South China Sea.
Mm-hmm.
You know, as to China playing by all the rules of WTO, well, I'm not sure it's all the rules.
Well, most of
the
it.
rules.
I mean, at least they know the game very well. Yeah.
And I think China plays the economic game.
Right.
That I do see. But this is geopolitical.
Right.
You know, so it's a different basket
Right.
altogether.
So
Why is China not actually signing on to the code of conduct? Professor Wang, I've always thought that China could be more generous on the South China Sea, you know, with smaller countries. I've said, China, big countries, great state autism. Big countries do not understand how small and medium-sized countries feel, and they do not understand small countries and medium-sized countries. China is a big country. Every country dealing with you in South China Sea is a smaller country, much smaller country. And initially, China was against ASEAN acting as a group. But how else can we act but otherwise? And actually, Southeast Asia, ASEAN is a swing vote in your competition with the United States. I would have thought it would be in China's interest to be generous with Southeast Asia, with ASEAN, and work out some agreements on the code of conduct in South China Sea.
Yeah, I think there's certainly, you know, China and the ASEAN countries can work out because I see that, you know, right now, Party Secretary General of Vietnam is visiting China, had a meeting with President Xi, and they had a very warm reception there. So I think there's always a way to discuss and consult and find a way to work out. I'm sure that would be the interest of China as well.
Right. Henry, you heard Dr. Luttwak say that NATO's reach into East Asia looks almost, did you say inevitable or it's happening?
No, well,
it's going
even the German government
yeah.
announced 3 weeks ago that Germany will no longer be able to cooperate with China. Strategically, they said so. The Chancellor said. The Chancellor was very pained about it because he was the last person
Sure.
to resist this. But the rest of the Germans, I'd like to, may I make a comment? I became acquainted with the realities of China in 1976 when Marshal Ye, at that time, I was, ridiculously enough, I was considered an expert in armored warfare because I'd taken part in actual armored warfare just a year before. So I was invited to China, Marshal Ye as a person, not as an institution. The first dinner I had was with Marshal Ye. And Marshal Ye said, we have 42 Soviet divisions aimed at Beijing. and we need to do something about it. We can't buy new tanks and so on. So I worked in China, and we had the solution of upgrading existing Chinese T-54 tanks together with the 105 gun of the British, and et cetera, to dramatically upgrade without building new tanks and so on. The Israelis supplied the ammunition and sold it, and so I was living in Beijing, and the Beijing Fund, and there were only 2 hotels in Beijing, one for the Russians and the Beijing Fund. When the waitress came, and I said, "Xie," she was not allowed to say "Buka Chee" because no Chinese person is allowed to talk to a foreigner. So she could not say "Buka Chee." Okay? So I'm brought in to help the Chinese army. I spent a lot of time with Chinese officers. There was a shortage of everything in China, but plenty of Mao Tai, Cao Liang, and so on. So I spent many evenings being drunk with various people. So that was the country of Mr. Mao, because Mr. Mao, at that point, he was dying, but the number one thing was his quarrel with Deng Xiaoping. So at every single meeting, before we could talk about ammunition or tanks or maintenance, we had people ritualistically denounced the capitalist roader Deng Xiaoping, who was held in house arrest somebody. I asked Marshall where he was, and he said he's in safe hands. That's what he said. So that was that China, and then subsequently I knew many other different things. And there never was China. China never existed, and China does not exist, because at that time there was Wang of the Gang of 4 people. The only one interested in tanks was Wang. So he brought me to Shanghai, gave me live shrimp for the Wampuka, and talked about tanks and so on. Because of the rationalities of the politics, there were 700 needed tanks were in Shanghai area because he controlled them through the workers' militia. So there was Wang, there was Mao. Then I dealt with the China of different people, including Hu Jintao. And there was Hu Jintao, that was real. Wen Jiabao was real. If Wen Jiabao was the head of the Chinese Communist Party today, we wouldn't be having this discussion. We'd be talking about other subjects, at all. So China has never existed for me. There was only this protagonist, Mao, and then it was Hu Jintao who was trying to win. When I remember happened to be in Beijing when there was the earthquake in Sichuan. And Wen Jiabao went and sat. I think I mentioned this with a cheap shirt and trousers next to the parents. He was projecting an image of the Chinese leader, not standing there like God, but, normal thing. So China does not exist, sure. And we're not dealing with China. We're dealing with Xi Jinping, and Xi Jinping's deep provincialism. The only time he ever spoke to a group of foreigners freely was in Mexico City. Please go back and read what he said, because this was a deeply, extremely alienated state. The other thing is, trading relations never prevented a war. In 1914, the French and German economies were completely intertwined. They, by far, the biggest trading nations were the French and Germans. They went to war in minutes like this without it. The other thing about maritime power, we should use 2 different words. One word is called sea power, or naval power, or whatever you call it, and that is, I'm a country, any country, I build ships. I have a lot of ships, aircraft carriers, cruisers, whatever. That's his sea power. Maritime power is different. It is having relationships with island countries, peninsular countries, and coastal countries, where first of all, you are providing service for them. They invite you into the ports. They give you radar coverage these days. In the ancient days, would supply you with food. And sea power destroys maritime power. Yeah. If you build warships and you don't have good relationships, you are destroying maritime power because people don't let you into the ports. That is the
Thank you very much, Dr. Luttwak. Henry, do you want to respond to anything Dr. Luttwak said?
I think I disagree with him a bit on that. He was saying that Germany is totally not cooperating with China or abandon China. I think that is not true. I mean, we see the Chancellor Scholz is visiting China this coming week, and also he just approved a big purchase of China, buying a a port of Hamburg.
Yeah,
a portion of that.
Costco bought something.
That's,
yeah. But it's
and
a
also
very
there's
small
a dozen
stake.
over quite a lot of German executive coming.
Sure.
So I still think, that we are living in a 21st century. The economic business, people-to-people integration is unprecedented in the history of mankind. So we cannot say, with such a deep integration, that, without hurting each other. I mean, if we have any bad going on.
Mm-hmm.
So even for China now, we have almost 2 million Chinese students or young people working in the United States.
Right.
That's a fact, 2 million families in China. So,
Right.
Vice versa, a lot of, foreigners can come to China. So I think, we are in a constant change. Anything happening is in your bedroom, in your television. You can see in your mobile. It's really, getting into the people's heart. A lot of people frightened and sees that. So I think we need to avoid that.
Can I answer this?
Just a second. You
Yeah,
heard,
Prime
no,
Minister-
hang on a second.
Yeah, may I just make a comment? Prime Minister Modi visited China 7 times. Some of these were multilateral visits, just say one. One was a state visit, where there were a lot of conversations between him and Xi Jinping. Then there was an informal summit in Wuhan, where they were together for a day and a half. Then there was a counterpart summit in Chennai, they were just talking with that. After that, Chinese troops crossed into Ladakh and forced the Indian government, whichever it is, to start cutting relations with China. Why did they cross into Ladakh? Well, I went to visit the place. It's actually rather beautiful. It's called Pankong Lake. And what happened is that the Indians have always lied about what happens at the border. They actually lost 2,500 square miles in previous penetrations, and they decided that they're going to take another 150, not square miles, it was a very small area, tiny area, maybe 2.5 kilometers square from Pankong Lake. Because of that, they crossed the border. Because of that, there was fighting. And because of that, 1 billion Indians hate China. Because of that, of 100 square meters. That is the reality level. But when you try and talk, let's say, with the defense minister of China, the defense minister of China is one of the most reasonable people I met in my life. He was the commander of the strategic rocket forces. He was in charge of the nuclear weapons. People in charge of nuclear weapons tend to get serious about the subject of war and peace. He was the commander of strategic rocket forces. So I met him several times and so on. But he is the decision maker. If he was up to him to cross the border and antagonize a billion Indians, it would never
Dr.
happen.
Luttwak, thank you for that.
Yes.
Let me just pick up on something Dr. Luttwak just said, combined with his mention of Madame Fuying earlier in his discourse. But, I once had the privilege of dining with Madame Fuying, and at that point, it was 10 years ago, and I asked her, what do you think about India, your relations with India, and do you think, where is it? And at that point, she described to me, the word she used was, India is well behaved. Today, do you think India has gone so far over to Dr. Luttwak that it's bothering you in China? I mean, to the people that Dr. Luttwak advises. Or rather, has the shift been so pronounced that today you've decided that it's not worth keeping a good relationship with India because ultimately the Indians are with the Americans? Is that the thinking in Beijing today?
No. I think India is an emerging largest economy coming up as well, and India has 1.4 billion. It's actually almost the same, even more than Chinese population now. So it's a huge potential. I think that the two countries has a huge potential to collaborate in the future because now China is already, like mobile phones, like all those companies, China is having a big market share already in India, and also that I see India and China has a lot of similar views. I mean, towards for example, on the war on Russia-Ukraine conflict, they don't favor sanctions, for example. So there's a lot of common language they can, and I think they really can work on each other. I can understand, but China did make a lot of progress. In the 1980s, China and India was enjoying the same GDP. Now China is 5 times more than India. So I think there's a lot of things they can exchange, can learn from each other, can really benefit from each other. So I think let's not concentrate on those tiny disputes. Let's really look at the big
No, it is very important to the
Yeah.
Indian national psyche that you
Oh,
lose
yeah,
territory.
that's true.
Nobody
I
will
mean,
give it up.
China also lost it there too. I mean, China doesn't like to get into the conflict there.
Sure.
You know, so
I want to
according
take
China, yeah, so
one question from the floor. We'll make it a brief one. And the question is about the Quad, whether you see it as a destabilizer. Henry, you can say that, maybe half a minute, you can give us your response. And then I'll ask Ambassador Chan to give a response. And then we'll look at the poll.
yeah, no, absolutely. I agree that we should have more like ASEAN, this kind of organization. Should have more economic organization, RCEP, CPTPP, DPA, and rather than we're having the secure military alliance. That's not make sense. China didn't form any military alliance. I mean, the Quad is basically a military, an AUKUS, are all really security military focused. So that's not good. That's really, one-sided moves to really, deteriorate the situation. It's not really good.
Okay. How does Southeast Asia view the Quad?
Too soon to tell.
Too soon to tell.
No, let me put it this way, that when the Quad was initially introduced, I think ASEAN countries were very cautious and did not want to sign on because it sounded very much like it was there to contain China. But I think the United States went around the region and they listened to some of the regional comments. And under President Biden, the Quad has been has morphed and emphasized far more on the common, agenda, kind of the global commons and delivering humanitarian aid and so on, vaccines, climate change. And given that, I think ASEAN countries have, some of the misgivings have sort of been, have reduced.
Abated.
Abated a bit,
Okay.
But of course, you can always step up what the Quad can do. But the Quad members don't all see eye to eye. I mean, you have seen how India behaved in the Ukraine conflict. Not exactly like the other 3 Quad members. So I think the Quad has, there's some independence within the Quad.
The Quad is only
Relate
a
to
China
China.
containment. It's not an
Right.
alliance. Only China containment.
I think
No
they're trying to
alliance at all.
move from that, yes.
No alliance
No,
at
in
all.
fact, I want to mention that Dr.
Yes.
Sevia's institute, ISA, has recently wrote a very interesting paper
Yes.
on the Quad and cyber. I found that of deep interest. Thank you for that, Dr. Sevia. I'd like to wind this up. I have a decent record of concluding my panels on time. I'd like to keep it. Can we take a look at the poll results, please? If you could flash them one by one on the screen. Okay. Will there be war in Asia in the next 5 years? And I'm afraid the consensus is that more than 60% do believe that there might be war in Asia in the next 5 years. The next one. If there's war between China and the US, Southeast Asia will
Stay neutral.
choose China 5%, side with the US 10%, stay neutral. Is that your sentiment too? Do you think so?
I think, yeah.
That's highly reflective.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Very reasonable.
Thank you.
Southeast Asia should stay neutral.
Thank you. Thank you. That's great. And the last question, please. Where could there be war in Asia in the next 5 years? Northeast Asia involving China, Taiwan, US, and Japan, overwhelmingly, 86%. South Asia involving China, India, and Pakistan, 9%. And all of Asia is 5%. I think we in Singapore should take comfort from that. We're least likely to get affected. And on that note, I wish to thank all of you for this brilliant panel. Thank you for traveling such a long distance.
I came from Hanoi.
Yeah, but
I
still.
came from Hanoi, where they told me that the visit to Beijing was just check.
Thank you again. It was wonderful being with you this morning. Thank you. Thank you.